Guys, how we doing? That's great. Awesome. My name is Josh. I'm the teaching pastor here, and we're in the middle of this series that we're calling Marked. It's this year-long series in the book of Mark, and the whole idea is that as we kind of walk through the life of Jesus, which is in the book of Mark, as we see him loving people, as we see the way that he loved us even 2,000 years ago, that our lives would be changed, that they would be begin to be marked by him, that something would happen to us in which we're transformed. That's kind of the whole idea. So we're taking this year, basically, and we're walking through the book of Mark. And if you've been with us, you know that we're in this section of the book of Mark in which Jesus is marching on Jerusalem. And so basically the first 8 chapters, the story that Mark is telling about Jesus, it focuses on like the first 3 years of his ministry. And the last 8 chapters really focus on maybe 2 months of his ministry. So the time frame gets kind of zooms in, and the really important things are happening. And Mark does a really good job. If you've read Mark all the way through, you know this. Mark does a really good job of building this sort of crescendo. There's energy, there's excitement, and Jesus, the things that he's saying and the things that he's doing, they're building. Something is going to happen soon, and he's marching on Jerusalem. And that's kind of the context of of the passage that we're going to be in today. He's marching on Jerusalem, and if you know, you probably heard in Christianity what we believe is that Jesus went to Jerusalem and he died. He died and he rose again, and then he ascended into heaven 40 days later. And so basically, Jesus is in the last 3 months of his life on earth. He's in the last stretch of his term here on this planet. And so the things that he says to his disciples have so much more importance than the things that he was saying before. Not that they weren't important, they were. But what Jesus is saying now is like, he really wants them to know. And today what we're going to be looking at, what we're going to see, is that what Jesus is telling his disciples in this passage that we're in is all about how to follow him. What does it look like to follow Jesus? It's all about what does it mean to be a Christian. And if you've been in church for the last 10, 20 years or so, you know that you may have felt this tension surrounding this question. There's a little bit of tension because the church is in a moment in which there are huge cultural changes happening, not just in our culture, but in the church culture. And I'd like to say that's a really good thing. We talked last week about how 85% of kids who are raised in church, they leave the church. So doing it the old way, not a good idea. Things have to change. Now, I want to make this distinction that we change things culturally, we don't change things biblically. So one of those big cultural changes that you've probably noticed in church over the last 20 years or so is we turn the music up a little bit. How many of you super appreciate that you can't hear the person next to you, right? Amen. I usually worship next to Steve. He's got a way better voice than I do. I'm just happy that he can't hear me. That's kind of what I'm happy about. So here's the thing. There are cultural things that are changing. It doesn't say anywhere in this Bible, thou shalt have 70 decibels of music in your service. It doesn't say that anywhere. We are free to make that change in church. It's a cultural change. But we're in this moment in which there's a lot of cultural change happening in the church. And whenever that happens, it's a great moment to re-examine the way that we've been doing things. Because very often the way that we do things is developed partly out of Scripture, but also partly out of the current cultural context, okay? And so what's been happening in church a lot is we're asking this question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Is the way we answered that question a cultural answer, or is it a biblical answer? And if you've been in church, for a while, maybe you're on this side of the spectrum. You're a traditionalist. And maybe the answer for you, how you follow Jesus, is that you make your life look like him. You change your behavior to act like him. You don't sin like he didn't sin. And here's the thing, that's partially true, right? Jesus didn't sin, and following him means acting like him. Following him means like walking the steps that he walked, and so that's partially true, but here's what this very often produces. It produces grumpy and angry Christians because they're upset that they're not having any joy in their life. They're not having deep heart transformation. They're just changing the surface of their life. And what happens very often in churches that put their emphasis on this is what it means to follow Jesus, you change your behavior, what very often happens is we're not perfect, and so when you do mess up, you hide it and you keep it away from everybody. And a lot of times the best strategy is to shift focus from you onto somebody else so you become judgy. You say, look at how they're messing up, hoping that they don't look at your life. That's what this kind of culture produces. It's why it needs to change. But maybe you're a traditionalist, and maybe that's kind of how you see the world. That's okay. You are welcome in this church. We love you, and we welcome everybody. But in response to that, a lot of churches have swung completely to the other end of the spectrum, in which they answer the question this way. It's not about changing your behavior. It's about loving and accepting everybody. And here's the thing. That, I think, is probably a little bit more true than that. Right? Because Jesus, I want you to see this. Jesus loves people whose lives are so messed up. He loves people and he accepts them for who they are and where they are, knowing that he is going to make them acceptable. This is a bit more gospel-centered because we believe as Christians that Jesus came because you had worth to him, because he wanted to make you acceptable. So now in Christianity, what we believe is that no matter where you're at in this room, because of his sacrifice, he loves you and he accepts you no matter what? That's what we believe. If you believe in Jesus, that is true for you. And so this is kind of a little bit of an improvement, but it's still a partial truth. And here's what I mean by that. If you live your life in a way in a way that you just love everybody, but you don't call them to change, but you don't call them to be something better than where they are right now, if you don't call them to live for a higher purpose, then all you've done is you just made Christianity nicer. That's all you did. That way is impotent. It won't make true heart change if you just change the surface of your life. It doesn't have the power to transform. This way also doesn't have the power to transform. You're just being nicer. That's all it is. So here's the answer that Jesus is going to give us today, and this is what we're going to be focusing on, and this is kind of how we see it here at this church. The answer to how you live the Christian life, what does it look like to live like Jesus, to follow him, is to live sacrificially. It's to live sacrificially. As a pastor, I've noticed this, that kind of how you answer that question, which end of the spectrum that you live on, tends to be what's easiest for you. And so maybe you're like a really relational person, and it's easy for you to show love, and it's easy for you to accept people, and it's easy for you to have this position, so maybe that's the position that you adopt. Or, and I'm probably overgeneralizing here, but maybe you're a task-oriented person, and for you, it's all about getting stuff done and doing it right, and so naturally, you just live your life this way. People tend to pick the option that's easier. What Jesus is calling us to is something that's much harder. What Jesus is calling us to is something that isn't easy to do at all. What Jesus is calling us to do is to completely give everything at his feet. Now, before we get into this, I want to deal with a common misconception. I think that we think that sacrifice or living sacrificially means giving our lives up for something, right? Like we think of Jim Elliot, a famous missionary, goes to South America, preaches the gospel to this unchurched, never heard the gospel tribe, and they end up killing him, and we think that's sacrifice, that's sacrificial. Here's the thing. Most of us will never have an opportunity to give our life for the gospel. That's just the truth. That's the country and the culture that we live in. Most of the time, we don't die for our faith. For most of us, what sacrifice looks like is the answer to this question: what are you living your life for? What are you living your life for? And here's why. Because we can get in this sort of mode of living in which we think, okay, today, what do I want to do today? Today I got to do X, Y, Z. I got to do this and this. I got to take the kids here. I got to pay these bills. And we get into this mode of living in which we're like just kind of floating through life, doing whatever life throws at us. We're just kind of handling it, but we're just kind of going through the motions. What sacrifice looks like is saying, okay, that I have to do that, but what I want to do is not live so that my focus and my attention and my life is down here. I want to live in such a way that it's up there. What you have to do is you have to say, okay, I'm going to take a time out from this. I'm going to sacrifice something so that I can spend some time with Jesus. Or maybe you're the type of person who is very driven. You know exactly the kind of life that you want to live. You want the kids, you want the house, you want the car, you want the picket fence. And that's the thing that you want, and you're pushing towards that. Sacrificial living means, God, I want that, but I want you more. What are you living your life for? It's not so much about what you're going to lose your life, but more what your focus and your intention is. Are you going to spend your life focused on him or focused down here? Three things that make up a sacrificial life before we kind of get into this biblically. Frequency, duration, and intensity. Frequency, duration, intensity. How often do you think of, spend time with, talk about God? Frequency. Duration. How much time do you actually spend pursuing him, reading scripture, memorizing scripture, praying? How much time do you spend? Intensity. What grabs your attention? What grabs your focus? What has the ability to take over your life? If the answer is God, awesome. You're well on your way to living a sacrificial life, because that means that nothing down here is as important as he is up there. That's a sacrificial life. So here's what we're going to see in this passage today, because Jesus is getting really intentional about this, okay? He's pulling his disciples aside to teach them what it means to follow him. And so what we're going to see is 2 how-tos and 2 how-not-tos. That's 4 total. I do math. 2 how-tos and 2 how-not-tos. And kind of how the passage is structured is there's a how-to, then there's 2 how-nots, and then there's 1 how-to. You follow? All right, repeat that back to me. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. You don't have to do that. We're going to walk through this together. How to live a sacrificial life, and 2 ways how not to live a sacrificial life. So we're going to pick this up. This is Mark chapter 10. We're going to pick it up in verse 32. Mark says this, "And they were on the road going to Jerusalem." Remember, Jesus is marching on Jerusalem. And Jesus was walking ahead of them. He's literally leading, and they're literally following him. And they were amazed. And those who followed were afraid. There's 2 groups. There's the disciples who are following Jesus, and they kind of know he's marching on Jerusalem. This is it. This is the moment. He's going to take over. He's going to throw off Roman rule. This is when everything we've been waiting for is going to happen, and they're amazed. They're like, yes, this is it. I'm so excited for this. But then there's a group of people who are following them, and they're kind of thinking like, okay, if there's 12 of them and 1 of him, that makes 13. There's probably 10,000 people in that city. How is this going to work? And they're a little bit afraid. What is going to happen? There's 2 groups of people here, and Jesus wants to focus on one group. Mark says this, "And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, 'See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise.'" Do you know what's interesting about this? This is actually the 3rd time that Jesus has predicted his death and his resurrection. The first time, it didn't go so well. Jesus says, "Hey guys, hey bros, I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again." Who's excited about that? And you know what the disciples say? "What? Jesus, that's stupid." Literally, Peter says that he rebuked him. He's like, "Jesus, you can't say that kind of stuff." It didn't go well. Jesus is the famous passage where Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," you know? So the first time Jesus says this, it doesn't go well. The second time he says this, it literally says the disciples were confused, and then the very next story, do you know what the disciples do? They start arguing about who's the greatest. So just picture the juxtaposition of this. Jesus says, "I'm going to die and rise again," and then the disciples are like, "Okay, I'm better than you." They didn't get it, you know? It just didn't go well. They fundamentally didn't understand. This is the 3rd time that he's doing it. And we're going to see they have a similar response. And for me, it begs this question, like, Jesus, if you know that they don't like what you're saying, if you know that they don't get what you're saying, if you know that what you're saying has 0 effect on them at all, why are you saying it? Why is it so important to you that you said it 3 times? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's more obvious than you think. It is. It's because it's important to him. For him, living a sacrificial life and teaching his disciples what exactly that means, practically, I'm going to go die and rise again, I'm going to give my life as a ransom. Living a sacrificial life for Jesus is a value. Do you know what a value is? A value is a guiding principle that you hold on to even when it's hard. A value is a guiding principle that you hold on to even when it's hard. It's a guiding principle. It's a way that you want to live your life. It's a goal that you're pursuing. It's a characterization of how you want to live, and you're pursuing that. And you pursue it with determination so hard that you're holding on to it even when it's hard. Jesus is doing this. He's saying, I want to live this life sacrificially. I want you to live this life sacrificially. And I'm going to keep saying that even though you don't like it. I'm going to keep saying that even if it's hard for you to understand. I'm going to keep saying that even though you have no idea what that means. It's a value. This is kind of the first how-to that I want to look at. if you want to live a life that is sacrificial, you have to value it. You have to value it. It has to be a part of your life, so much so that it's the goal that you're pressing towards. It's the thing that's on your mind whenever you go to work. It's the thing that's on your mind when you're driving and somebody cuts you off. It's the thing that's on your mind when your kid disobeys you for the 70,000th time. That didn't happen this week, I promise. It's the thing that's on, living sacrificially is the thing that's on your mind when people around you are hard to deal with. It has to be something that you value. I think values are a really interesting thing to talk about because sometimes I think that we don't know what we value. Like if I asked you, name your top 3 values, how do you want to live your life? What are the things that you want your life to look at? How many of you would just have a ready answer? Good for you. That was 5 people of maybe 150 in here right now. I think most of us don't answer this question very often. So this week, here's my challenge to you. Think about Jesus, think about the Christian life, and answer this question. What are the 3 things you want your life to look like? And here's what I want you to put at the top, or maybe number 2, if you could argue with me, I guess, is living a sacrificial life. I want to live a life the way Jesus did. The only way that you live a sacrificial life is if you value it, if it's important to you. So that's a value. That's 1 how-to. Let's look at 2 how-not-tos. So this is a fun one. James and John, this is verse 35, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." This is a good start, right? Does anybody have a sense of foreboding, like doom, you know? Yeah, that'd be accurate. Verse 36, and he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it is being prepared." And when the 10 heard it, so that's the other, 10 minus 2 is, or 10 plus 2 is 12, so that's 12. When the other 10 heard it, they became indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." What is going on here? Has anybody ever asked you before, "Hey, can I sit at your right hand and your left hand in your glory?" Anybody ever got that one? No? Not a common question. Here's what's going on culturally back then. Whenever a conqueror would take over land or a new king was to be crowned, he would give his peeps, he'd give his bros a place of prominence. And they would sit, as he's enthroned, they would sit at his right and his left. We have a kind of a similarity to this in our culture. We say somebody is my right-hand man. Have you ever heard that phrase? What that means is my right-hand man is somebody who's always with me, who is figuring out what needs to happen. He's always sitting next to me, making sure that things get done. That's a right-hand man. Similarly, the guys who sit at the right and the left were usually military generals or people who had a lot of influence in the city, and they were given this seat so that they would be on the king's team, right? And so this is the place of prominence. So here's 2 how-not-tos, okay? The first one is a little bit difficult. It's a little bit controversial, but we're going to walk there anyway. I want you to see this. For James and John, they don't get the gospel at all. What them asking this question, what it shows, is they still think that Jesus is coming to be a king here on the earth, that he was coming to throw off Roman rule, that he was coming to usher in a new era of an earthly reign and rule here on the earth where Israel is in charge of, and not Rome, it's Israel is in charge of the planet. That's what they think. And I want you to see this. This is the hard part. That for them, what got in the way of living sacrificially was their political view. How they saw the world being run got in the way of them understanding what it really means to love sacrificially. Remember I said that living sacrificially is at least these 3 things. It's frequency, duration, and intensity. So let me just ask you this question right now. How do you view politics? How often? What's your frequency? How often do you think about winning the argument? How often do you think about that person who posted that thing and I just can't believe that? How often does that come in your brain? How long does it last when it comes in your brain? What's the duration? How much time do you think in your day do you think you spend thinking about politics? Intensity. Does politics have the ability to completely take over your life whenever it comes up? Like all of a sudden it's the only thing you can think about. Frequency, intensity, and duration. You can tell right away if you are living a life for down here, if you're living a life to win the argument, if you're living a life to be right, you can tell right away if you're not living sacrificially. Because for you, what's most important, what you value is winning, is being right. So here's my question to you. What's getting in the way of you living sacrificially? Is it our current political context? Here's the thing. If you want to live a life that has meaning and value, then live sacrificially. Because politics come and go. Have you ever noticed in the news cycle, the thing that was huge last week is not the thing that's huge this week? Politics has a way of fading. Leaders fade. Ideologies fade. And really, if you're a Christian, here's what you believe. There's really only one political system that is perfect. There's only one that works. It's called the second coming. When Jesus comes back, brings heaven to us, and he establishes his rule in truth and justice and mercy and love, that's the perfect one. And so if you spend all of your time thinking about an imperfect system, if you spend all of your time thinking about how to manage things down here and you refuse to give that up so that you can spend some time with the true king, with the true kingdom, maybe you're not living your life sacrificially. Maybe you're not following Jesus in a way that you could. Maybe you're missing out on what it's like to have a relationship with him. Okay, we're going to move on from the controversy. Who's excited? Me, yes. Okay, here's the second thing. How not to live a life sacrificially. What James and John are asking is, Jesus, when you conquer everybody, when everybody's coming before you to bow before you, we want to sit next to you. We want to have the place of prominence. We want to be shown to everybody as your favorites, as the great ones. We want to be famous. We want to have power. Here's how not to live sacrificially. Live for your own personal prominence. Live for your own greatness. So often what gets in the way of us living for Jesus is us living for ourselves. Here's a particular way that this happens. A lot of times in church, we promote people who are really good at getting stuff done instead of promoting people who are servants. We give jobs in places of leadership to people who if you're a traditionalist, who their life looks like Jesus. It looks good on the surface, but there's not really heart change. Or sometimes we give jobs to people who are really good at, who are really loving and kind. And that's none of these things are necessarily bad. But here's what Jesus is saying, and here's what James and John are learning, is that sacrifice, servanthood, that's what the kingdom is about. That's what leadership in the kingdom is all about. When I was in my early 20s, and this is kind of like a facet of being young in your 20s and a guy, you're just arrogant. You know, you're two things. You're hungry and arrogant. And it just is true. And I had such a strong drive to be a pastor. And part of that was because I had this amazing experience with God in which I really feel like he called me to do this. But the other part was I get to talk to people. And people get to listen to what I have to say. I was journaling this week about that. And I was going over my journals from back then. And I was weeping at the perversion of what it means to be a pastor that was in my mind at that point. I heard this great story from another pastor who he was teaching on this verse, and he just said, you know what we did at this church that he was at? We made our number one criteria for leadership service, having a servant's heart. And he tells this story of how they were praying for, they needed to fill a position. It was like a family life pastor, and they really needed to fill his position, and they didn't know who they were going to get. And one day, he was staying after, he had to lock up after a Sunday service, and he goes into the sanctuary, and there's a guy, and he's walking in and out of the rows, and he's like, well, I got to lock up, so I got to tell this guy to leave. So he goes up to the guy and he says, hey, I got to lock up. It's time to go. And he said, oh, well, I was just picking up all of the trash. Where do I put? I got some lost and found items. Where do I put this? And he realized that he had a 3-year-old son who this guy had taught to crawl under the chairs and to find all of the trash and bring him the trash. And so he and his son were staying after to clean up the auditorium. And this pastor says, do you have any ministry experience? He said, well, yeah, I used to be a pastor. There's this great story of how God answered this prayer that they were looking for this guy. And he did it because he valued service. He was looking for somebody who was out serving everybody else. I think that when we value living sacrificially, when we make leadership, the accountability that we're held to is sacrificial, not like being a good teacher, not being really influential, not nailing a sermon every single Sunday, but if we make the standard for leadership, for service in our church, if we make it serving, if we make it sacrificing, I wonder what would happen. I wonder if, because that's being modeled, I wonder if our church would begin to do it as well. I wondered if we started modeling it, if the people in our lives would think, man, this seems to be something that's really, I want to live my life like that person. What would change if we started to value living sacrificially instead of living for ourselves? Do you know what I think? I think the gospel would go forth. I think that lives would be changed. Because I think the fundamental question on our people who live in our culture every day, the fundamental question on our mind is, how do I get more out of life? And if we can model happy, joyful service, that's something that I think that they're looking for. How do I get more joy and peace out of my life? And if we show them the answer is generosity, the answer is service, I just think that things would start to happen. That's a how not to. Don't live for personal prominence. Live for sacrifice. So we saw one how-to, that's you have to value sacrificial living. We saw 2 how not to's. You have, living for politics or living for personal prominence. Those are 2 how not to's. Here's the last one. This is the very practical how-to. This is verse 42. And Jesus called them to him and he said, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority. I want you to picture like an iron fist, just bam. They exercise authority over them. And here's the key phrase, but it shall not be so among you. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be the greatest among you would be your servant. You must be your servant. And whoever would be the first among you must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Here's a practical how-to if you want to live your life sacrificially, if you want to follow Jesus truly, live like a servant. So back in the day, this word servant, it's the word diakonos. It's where we get the same word for deacon. It literally meant a household servant. You know, one of the main jobs of a household servant was to wash people's feet when they came in the door, as a courtesy that they would have back then, that they would wash your feet. People really needed their feet washed back then. And here's why. Walking through a street in ancient Jerusalem is way different than walking through a street now. You wore open-toed shoes. You know, they had sandals. They didn't have like a closed-toed shoe that we have. The streets had animals in the streets. Especially if you walk through like the meat market where they're cutting up stuff, there's stuff in the streets. They didn't have indoor plumbing back then. There's stuff in the streets. You know what I mean? And so when somebody would come over, it was a courtesy. The servant would go and they would wash their feet. Here's a great question for you. If you want to live sacrificially this week, whose crap are you going to clean up? It's true. Like, I think so often we think that if you're in hot water, it's your fault. If you have a mess in your life, it's because you messed it up. It's not my job to help you. In Jesus, we see the exact opposite. In Jesus, we see him actually washing the disciples' feet. We see him going to people who are living their lives in a terrible way and healing them and making their life better. The way you live, the way you follow Jesus, the way you live like him, the way you live the Christian life is sacrificial. Whose crap do you clean up this week? I think that if we were able to change, if we were able to live our lives more sacrificially, I think that things would change. There's a couple of things I want to share with you actually before we, let me go here first, before we close today. Do you know how this story ends? This is my favorite. See, this story doesn't end in Mark chapter 10, verse 45. This story ends actually dozens of years later. See, here's the thing. James and John, they start this journey here with Jesus, and they're like, Jesus, we want to sit at your right and at your left. We want the place of prominence. But here's the thing. Walking with Jesus changes them. They become something completely different. Over the next 10 years, James writes a book of the Bible. It's called James. Hey, have you ever read it? That's James. That's this guy. He writes a book of the Bible. He also takes charge of the church in Jerusalem. He becomes the de facto leader of the apostles in Jerusalem. And after about 10 years, a new guy takes over politically, and he wants to please the Romans, and we've got these rabble-rousing Christians. And so what he does, he says, I'm going to execute one of their leaders. And the story goes that they grabbed James, they brought him literally to the chopping block, and the executioner lifts his sword or axe or whatever it was to behead him, and he looks at James's face, and he sees the resolve, and he sees the courage, and he sees the peace that is on his face. And the story goes that he drops his axe or sword or whatever, falls to his knees, and cries out to Jesus for help. They had to bring another executioner in to kill him. That's crazy. That's how this story ends. James, who's like, hey, Jesus, can I sit at your right? I just want to be in the place of prominence. James ends up drinking the cup that Jesus drank. Do you know what happened to John? John is an even crazier story. John goes into Turkey, and he founds these churches, and he builds this community. Over the course of his life, he writes a couple books of the Bible. He writes John, the Gospel of John. He writes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Those are letters that he sent. He also writes the book of Revelation. You know that one in the end that's really crazy? John wrote that one. Here's the thing. John lived his life in such a way that he escaped death for a long time. That people tried to persecute him, but he was always one step ahead. But finally, they caught up to him. Finally, he was the last apostle that was still alive. So what they did is they took him, and they decided that they wanted to boil him in oil. And so they get this fire going, and they bring in more wood. So this fire is going, this cauldron of this huge, enough to put a human in, is boiling over with oil. And you can just see the flames. Have you ever boiled, like, a grease fire? Just the instant ignition. And what they do is they drop John into this vat of boiling oil. And 5 minutes later, they go to pull him out because this guy should be dead. And he's still alive. They pull him out, and he looks, according to tradition, he looks as if he's never been touched. And they pull him out, and they're like, we can't kill this guy. Like, he literally can't die. And so what they do is like, well, I don't know what to do with him. So they send him to an island called Patmos, and that's where he writes the book of Revelation. They had no idea how to kill him. Can you imagine Jesus' words, you will be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? Can you imagine the significance for John? He literally was. And here's how this story ends. These guys who start off arrogant, who start off wanting more for themselves, they end up living a life sacrificially. And do you know what happened? Do you know the result, the fruit of their faithfulness? The result, the fruit of their sacrifice? It's us. We get to read the books. How many of you have a verse memorized from James or John? James is like one of those things that people are like, oh yeah, tame your tongue. I love that stuff. The heritage, the legacy of these guys who live sacrificially is that they influence Christianity forever. They changed the face of how Christianity looked. And here's the thing. If we want to have impact in our community, if we want to have impact in this city, if we want to be a church that is a light on a hill, that is salt of the earth, if we want to be a church that is going to transform this city, then what we have to do is we have to begin to value living sacrificially. We have to live for him. We have to give up our rights, our dreams, our wants, and our desires so that other people can live a better life. We have to work for the goodness here on earth and the glory of the God that we serve. We have to live for the true king and the true kingdom instead of this kingdom down here. And when we do that, I believe that we'll start to see big changes. I don't really know how to solve the problem of not enough Christians in Toledo. I don't really know how to fix this city. I didn't go to college for city fixing. If you did, I'll talk to you, but I didn't. Here's the thing. I don't know how to do this, but here's what I know. At the end of the night, I am more afraid of not trying than I am of trying and failing. I am more afraid of living a life that didn't have any impact in this city than if I tried and failed. And here's the thing, I want to be a part of something that is the solution. I want to try. I just want to throw anything at the wall and see what sticks. I just want to do anything and everything to see what works. And so part of that in the fall is we've come up with some plans that we want to do to show radical, outrageous, crazy love to our community. I want to share a couple ideas that we have. We're going to be doing this series. It's called Love No Matter What. And it's the whole idea, this living sacrificially, no matter the cost, loving no matter how difficult that person is to love no matter what. And so that's the series. I'm really excited about that. It's going to be fun. But what's going to be more fun is the things that we're doing around that. We're going to do a couple big acts of love for the community. I want to share a couple of them with you. Know this is the tip of the iceberg. One of the things that we want to do is to pay bomb a Jets. So Jets is down the road there. We're going to pick a night and we're going to pay for pizza for everybody who orders pizza there. And basically we're going to put a sticker on there that says, "Hey, Jesus loves us. We want to love you. I hope you feel loved by this gift." That's what we're going to do. I met with the Jets guy. This is the second service. We got time. I met with the Jets guy in this lobby right here, and he walks in, and I'm a little nervous because I'm like, we want to do this. This is super important, right? And he walks in, he's like, "Brother," and he gives me this huge hug. He's like from Detroit. He's from the hood, and he's just like, "Man, this is awesome." He's like, "So tell me more." And so I'm start sharing this stuff. He's like, "This is so cool." He's like, I live in Ann Arbor, and I wish that churches would be this loving to their communities. I'm like, yes, this is awesome. Okay, so that's one of the ideas that we have. We have another idea that we're going to do is we're going to have a stuff the tip jar week, and basically we're going to have people nominate people on Facebook who deserve a big tip. And so what we're going to do is we're going to show up and we're going to stuff their tip jar. Maybe I don't even know $300-$500, something that is really crazy. It's something that makes them think, why would they do that? Because Jesus did something even crazier for us. It's an awesome way to show somebody some love and then also have an opportunity to share the gospel. And so we have 5 total ideas. I just told you 2. But basically, what I want to invite you to do is to join us this fall. I don't know if this sticks. I don't know if this is the thing that will stick. I don't know if this is the thing that works, but here's what I know. I want to be a part of trying. At the end of the day, I can't live with myself if I didn't try. And so what I want to ask you to do is to join us as we do this. Every week when we do something during this series, there's going to be a way for you to get involved as well. Maybe on the big tip week, maybe you can participate by giving your barista, giving your pizza delivery guy, giving whoever. Maybe you participate by giving them an outrageous tip, whatever that is for you. Maybe on the Pay Bomb Jets day, maybe for you, it's about buying the person who groceries behind you. Maybe it's about buying the coffee at Starbucks for the person behind you. Maybe it's about if you're in line at Taco Bell, which I'm 6 times a week, 7 times a week. I'm okay, I'm okay. Maybe it's about paying for the person behind you. Just add an extra 20 onto that. Do something to love somebody in a way that costs you, in a way that they know that cost you. Because here's the thing. So often we hey, I love you. You know what that costs to say that? Nothing. Sometimes we say, hey, I love you, and I'll do the dishes for you, honey, or something like that. You know what it cost me to do the dishes? 20 minutes. When we love sacrificially in a way that they know it cost us something, that's when people start to feel the love. And they feel the love not just of us, because we're not doing it for us. They feel the love of Jesus. Here's my big question. What if this caught on? What if in a couple of years this became something that our city does? Not just us, but the other churches in our city. Not just the churches, but what if the local businesses had a buy one for somebody else and you get 75% off deals, that we encourage people to love on one another? What if banks started to join in and say, we're going to forgive one small loan this week in October? What if we got the Blade to post a positive story about somebody who was loving sacrificially, front page every day that week? What if we got this whole city on this train to love one another no matter what, to do something to love somebody in a way that costs you? What would happen to our city? What would happen if it wasn't just another let's love everybody push? If it wasn't just let's just accept everybody, but what would happen if it was motivated by somebody who really can change their lives? What if at the center of it was Jesus? I don't know if this is the thing that we throw at the wall, and I don't know if it's the thing that sticks, but I know that I want to try, and I want to ask you to join me. You know what happened to Mark? Mark writes this story. Mark goes to preach the gospel in a city, Alexandria. And basically, they get really irritated that he's doing that. And what they do is to kill him, they drag him to death. They have he's behind a chariot, and he gets dragged to death. Peter is crucified upside down. Andrew is crucified upside down. All of the disciples, almost all of them, die by martyrdom. And you know why they did it? Because they knew that the guy that they followed did it for them. That he died a death for them, that he lived sacrificially for them. I'm going to bring the band up, but I want to close with this idea. The reason that we love sacrificially, the inspiration that comes to help us to live the sacrificially, the thing that gives us the drive to do that is looking at the cross and seeing that it was done for you. And so if you're the kind of person that struggles to love the hard people, if you're the kind of person that struggles to live sacrificially, here's what I would encourage you to do. Fight your battles through worship. Fight your selfishness through worship. Fight your focus on earthly things through worship. Why don't you go ahead and stand up? We're going to sing this next song. It's all about what Jesus has done for us, and it's all about living a life for him. It's about putting him on the throne instead of other things. And as we sing this, here's what I'd encourage you to do. Sing it from the bottom of your heart. Really, really mean it. Because as you do that, here's what I think. I think that your heart changes even just a little bit. Maybe you get a little closer to living like Jesus did. Let's worship together.